The duchy stood in austere grandeur, its towering stone walls casting long shadows over the valley below, as though even the sun hesitated to linger near its lord. Within those walls ruled Duke, a young nobleman whose reputation had already hardened into legend. At 24, he governed with precision and restraint, his decisions swift, his demeanor colder than the marble halls he walked. Servants spoke in hushed tones when he passed, not out of fear alone, but from the unsettling certainty that he saw more than he revealed and felt far less than he should. On an overcast morning, as a restless wind stirred the banners above the gates, an unfamiliar figure approached the estate. Just 21, walked with measured steps despite the exhaustion that tugged at her limbs. Her dress, though simple and worn from travel, was clean, and her posture carried a quiet dignity that refused to bend beneath scrutiny. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt, yet her eyes remained clear, steady, and determined as she requested entry. The guards exchanged uncertain glances at her calm insistence. She did not plead, nor did she offer credentials befitting the grandeur of the place she sought to enter. Instead, she spoke with a composure that unsettled them, requesting an audience with the Duke as though it were a matter of inevitability rather than privilege. After a brief delay and reluctant approval, she was escorted through the vast corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier, steeped in order and silence. Noticed how everything seemed meticulously arranged, yet devoid of warmth. Even the light filtering through tall windows appeared muted, as though the walls themselves absorbed any hint of comfort. She followed her escort into a grand chamber where Duke stood near a long table, reviewing documents with sharp focus. He did not look up immediately when she entered, as though her presence barely registered. When he finally raised his gaze, it was not curiosity that met her, but irritation at the interruption. His expression remained composed, yet his eyes held a distant severity that made conversation feel like a burden rather than an exchange. "You requested an audience," he said, his voice controlled and even though laced with impatience. "Speak quickly." Inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his authority without surrendering her composure. "Your Grace, I have come regarding a matter tied to your past. It concerns a debt that was never acknowledged." The Duke's expression did not change, though a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "I do not entertain vague claims," he replied. "If you seek compensation, present proof. If not, you waste my time." "I seek neither coin nor favor," answered quietly, "only that you listen." A faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his growing irritation. He stepped away from the table, his posture straight and imposing as he approached her. Up close, his presence felt sharper, like a blade honed by years of discipline and solitude. "You presume much," he said. "People arrive here daily with fabricated stories, hoping to gain something. You are no different." Met his gaze without flinching, though her hands tightened slightly at her sides. "I would not have come if it were not necessary." The simplicity of her words, devoid of desperation or embellishment, lingered for a brief moment. Yet the Duke's patience had already worn thin. He had neither the inclination nor the trust to entertain mysteries, especially from strangers who appeared without warning. "Then you should have reconsidered," he said coldly. "This estate is not a place for riddles or sentimental claims." There was a pause, brief but heavy, as though the air itself waited to see whether she would retreat. Instead, took a small step forward. "Years ago," she began, her voice steady, "your life was—" "That is enough." His interruption was swift, cutting through her words before they could take form. Whatever she intended to reveal was dismissed with a single gesture of his hand, sharp and final. "I will not indulge this," he continued. "You speak of the past as though it grants you authority, yet you offer nothing of substance. I have no patience for this performance." His expression shifted, not into anger but into something quieter, more resolute. "You may not remember," she said, "but that does not make it untrue." The Duke's gaze hardened. Truth requires evidence, not conviction. For a fleeting instant, something flickered beneath his calm exterior, a restrained urgency that threatened to break through her composure. But just as quickly it was contained. "I see," she said softly. The Duke turned away, signaling the end of the audience as decisively as he had begun it. "Then you understand that this conversation is over." Hesitated as though weighing whether to press further, but the finality in his tone left no room for argument. The distance between them felt greater now, not measured in steps, but in the unyielding barrier of his disbelief. As she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on him for a brief moment. "There was a night," she said, her voice quiet yet distinct, "when the storm did not stop and neither did the bleeding." The Duke's hand paused against the edge of the table, though he did not turn. "You were not alone," she added. Silence followed, thick and unbroken. Without waiting for a response, continued toward the door. The guards opened it, and she stepped back into the corridor, her footsteps steady despite the weight of the encounter. Behind her, the chamber remained still. Duke stood unmoving, his expression unchanged to any observer, yet the faint echo of her words lingered in his mind with unsettling persistence. The memory she had brushed against remained indistinct, like a shadow at the edge of thought, impossible to grasp yet equally impossible to ignore. After a moment he dismissed it with a quiet breath, returning his attention to the documents before him. Yet the precision that usually guided his focus faltered, if only slightly. The ink on the page blurred as his thoughts drifted, unbidden, toward something buried deep within his past. Outside stepped beyond the gates without looking back. The wind had grown stronger, carrying with it the promise of rain. She pulled her shawl closer, her expression calm, though her eyes held a quiet resolve that had not diminished. She had not expected belief, nor had she come seeking approval. What mattered was that she had spoken, even if her words had been cast aside. Still, as she walked away from the imposing estate, there was no trace of defeat in her steps. Within the walls she had left behind, something had shifted, however faintly. And though the Duke refused to acknowledge it, the past she carried had already begun to stir, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. Sleep did not come easily to Duke that night, though he had long trained himself to function without indulgence. The chamber was silent, the fire reduced to embers, yet his thoughts refused to settle into their usual order. The young woman's voice lingered with quiet persistence, not loud enough to demand attention but impossible to dismiss entirely. He had encountered countless petitioners before, each weaving stories for sympathy or gain, yet none had left behind such a precise disturbance. Her words had not been elaborate nor pleading, and perhaps that was what unsettled him most. He rose before dawn, abandoning the pretense of rest. The estate remained cloaked in gray light, its corridors empty as he moved through them with measured steps. Routine had always been his refuge, a structure that kept distractions at bay, but even the familiarity of his surroundings failed to restore clarity. Each task he attempted dissolved beneath the weight of a memory he could not fully grasp. It lingered just beyond reach, like a fragment obscured by time and refusal. When he entered his study, he paused at the threshold, his gaze drifting toward the far wall where older records were stored. There were accounts he rarely revisited, documents tied to a period he had deliberately sealed away. Yet now, without fully deciding to, he crossed the room and retrieved a weathered ledger. Dust clung faintly to its cover, a sign of long neglect rather than disuse. He opened it with care, scanning entries that documented expenditures, reports, and correspondences from years past. The details were precise, yet incomplete in ways that had once gone unquestioned. There were references to an incident, an attack perhaps, or a misfortune written with clinical brevity. His injury had been noted, along with the urgency of his recovery, but there were gaps where explanations should have been. No names were recorded beyond those of his household staff, no mention of any outsider who might have intervened. His brow tightened slightly as he turned another page. The absence of detail, once insignificant, now seemed deliberate. He closed the ledger, the faint sound echoing in the quiet room. It was not proof, nor even certainty, but it aligned too closely with the woman's claim to ignore entirely. A knock sounded at the door, measured and unobtrusive. At his acknowledgement, one of the senior attendants entered, carrying the day's correspondence. The man hesitated briefly, as though sensing the shift in the Duke's mood. "Your Grace," he said, placing the letters upon the desk, "there is nothing of urgency this morning." Regarded him for a moment before speaking. "There was an incident several years ago," he said, his tone even. "During a storm, I was injured." The attendant's posture stiffened slightly. "Yes, Your Grace." "Who attended to me?" The man hesitated, his gaze lowering. "The household physician was summoned. The staff ensured your safety until his arrival." Studied him, nodding the careful phrasing. "And before that?" A pause followed, longer this time. "There was confusion, Your Grace. The circumstances were uncertain." "Uncertain," repeated, his voice quieter. The attendant inclined his head, offering no further detail. The silence stretched, and though no defiance was shown, there was a restraint that spoke more clearly than words. Whatever had occurred had not been fully recorded, and those who knew more had chosen, or been instructed, to remain silent. "You may go," said at last. When the door closed, the room felt heavier, as though the past he had ignored now pressed inward from all sides. He had built his life on control, on the careful management of knowledge and perception, yet here was something that existed beyond that control. The thought did not anger him as much as it unsettled him. Elsewhere, beyond the estate's imposing walls, moved through the modest quarters she had secured for herself. The room was small but orderly, containing only what was necessary. She had lived with less before, and comfort had never been her aim. What mattered was distance, enough space to think without interference. She set aside the shawl she had worn the day before, smoothing its folds with absent care. The encounter at the estate replayed in her mind, not with bitterness but with a quiet acceptance. She had anticipated disbelief, though the finality of his dismissal had been sharper than expected. Still, she did not regret going. There were truths that needed to be spoken, regardless of whether they were received. From a small case, she retrieved a single object, its surface worn yet carefully preserved. She held it for a moment, her expression softening with memory. It was not valuable in the way the Duke might measure worth, yet it carried a history that could not be dismissed so easily. For years, it had been a reminder of both sacrifice and loss, a connection to a moment that had altered everything. She returned it to its place, her movements deliberate. There was no urgency in her actions, no attempt to force what could not yet be resolved. If the Duke chose to ignore her, she would not pursue him further. Her purpose had never been to demand, only to present the truth. What he did with it was his own burden. By midday, the sky had darkened, clouds gathering with a quiet intensity that mirrored the tension left unresolved. Within the estate stood once more in his study, though his attention had shifted from the tasks before him to the questions he could no longer dismiss. The fragments of memory had grown sharper, the suggestion of a storm, of pain, of a presence he could not name. He exhaled slowly, the decision forming with reluctant clarity. Pride urged him to let the matter fade, to dismiss it as coincidence or fabrication. Yet something deeper, something less easily silenced, compelled him otherwise. Without summoning an attendant, he reached for his coat and moved toward the door. The estate behind him remained as it always had, ordered and unyielding, but as he stepped beyond its walls, the certainty that defined him felt less absolute. The road ahead was not long, yet each step carried a weight he could not ignore. He did not know what he would find, nor whether the answers would bring clarity or further unrest. What he knew with growing certainty was that the past he had chosen to forget had not released him in return. As the first drops of rain began to fall, continued forward, drawn not by obligation, but by the quiet insistence of a truth that refused to remain buried. Rain traced steady lines along the narrow streets as Duke approached the modest lodging where resided, each step eroding the certainty he had long relied upon. The storm carried a familiar weight, stirring fragments of memory that no longer felt distant or easily dismissed. He paused briefly outside the door, not from hesitation alone, but from the unfamiliar recognition that whatever lay beyond it might alter him in ways he could not control. He knocked once, the sound firm but restrained. A moment passed before the door opened, revealing standing within the quiet confines of her room. She did not appear surprised to see him, though her gaze sharpened with quiet awareness. There was no triumph in her expression, no sense of vindication, only a calm readiness that unsettled him more than any accusation could have. "You have returned," she said, her voice even. "I require clarity," replied, his tone measured though less rigid than before. "What you said yesterday was incomplete." Studied him for a brief moment before stepping aside, allowing him to enter. The room was simple, its contents sparse but orderly, reflecting a life shaped by necessity rather than comfort. He took in the surroundings with a glance, noting the absence of excess, the careful arrangement of each object. It contrasted sharply with the estate he had left behind, and for reasons he could not fully explain, the difference weighed upon him. "You dismissed what I began to tell you," she said, closing the door. "Why seek it now?" "Because it aligns with something I cannot ignore," he answered. "If there is truth in your claim, I will hear it fully." Her gaze did not soften, though a subtle shift in her posture suggested she had expected this outcome. "Very well," she said, "but understand this, I will not repeat myself beyond what is necessary." Inclined his head slightly, accepting the condition without argument. "There was a night," began, her voice steady, "when you were found near death beyond the eastern ridge. The storm had already begun, and those who accompanied you had either fled or fallen. You were not expected to survive." The words struck with quiet precision, each one aligning with the fragments he had struggled to recall. Images surfaced more clearly now, the relentless rain, the disorientation, the sharp pain that had threatened to consume him. "I remember little of that night," he admitted. "You were not conscious for most of it," she replied, "but someone found you before the storm could claim what remained." His expression tightened slightly. "Who?" Moved toward the small case resting upon the table and opened it with deliberate care. From within, she retrieved a worn object, its edges softened by time yet preserved with unmistakable intent. She held it out not as an offering but as evidence. "My father," she said. Took the object, his gaze fixed upon it as recognition stirred with unsettling clarity. It was not the item itself that struck him, but the memory it carried, faint at first, then sharpening into something undeniable. A voice steady despite exhaustion, hands that had worked without hesitation, a presence that had refused to abandon him. He found you alone, continued. He carried you through the storm when others would have left you. He gave what strength he had to keep you alive until help arrived. His grip on the object tightened slightly. Why was this never recorded? Because he did not belong to your world, she answered. And when the physician arrived, it was easier to accept a version of events that required no explanation. The simplicity of her words carried a weight that pressed heavily against his composure. And your father? His gaze remained steady, though a quiet depth emerged beneath her restraint. The storm did not spare him. By the time he ensured you would live, he had nothing left. Silence settled between them, heavier than before. The room seemed smaller, the air more difficult to draw. His thoughts shifted rapidly, each realization cutting deeper than the last. The life he had continued without question had been secured through a sacrifice he had never acknowledged. I was never told, he said, though the words felt insufficient even as he spoke them. No, replied, you were not. He set the object carefully upon the table, as though the weight of it had grown too great to hold. And you came here for recognition of this? He asked. I came because it was time you knew, she said, nothing more. There must be more, he insisted, a faint edge entering his voice. No one carries such a truth without reason. Met his gaze without yielding. You assume that everything must lead to gain, it does not. Her words struck with quiet force, dismantling the framework through which he had always understood such encounters. Then why reveal it at all? Because it was not meant to remain hidden, she answered, and because silence would have allowed it to be forgotten entirely. Turned away, the movement abrupt as he struggled to reconcile what he had learned with what he had believed. The distance between who he was and who he had thought himself to be felt suddenly vast. I dismissed you, he said, his voice lower now, without hearing you, without question. Yes, replied without accusation. The absence of bitterness in her tone unsettled him more than anger would have. It left no space for defense, no justification he could offer that would lessen the weight of his actions. I can restore your position, he said after a moment, the words measured but strained. Ensure you are provided for, your family's sacrifice warrants. No. The interruption was calm but absolute. His expression remained composed, though her refusal carried a quiet finality. I did not come for charity, she said, nor for obligation disguised as generosity. It is not charity, insisted, it is restitution. It is too late for that, she replied. The words settled with undeniable clarity. What had been lost could not be replaced, no matter the resources he commanded. The realization stripped away the last remnants of control he had attempted to maintain. For the first time, uncertainty showed plainly in his expression. Then what remains? He asked. Regarded him steadily, as though measuring not his words but the sincerity behind them. That depends on what you choose to become, she said. He held her gaze, the question lingering between them with no immediate answer. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, as though marking the passage of something that could not be undone. Within the quiet room, the truth had been spoken in full, leaving no room for denial or retreat. And though nothing had yet been resolved, the distance between them had shifted, no longer defined by ignorance but by the weight of what came next. The rain had lessened by the time Duke stepped back into the open air, though the weight of what he carried had not eased with it. Each word had spoken remained fixed in his thoughts, stripping away the certainty he had once worn without question. The path before him led back to the estate, to the life he had constructed through discipline and distance, yet that life no longer felt sufficient. Something within him had shifted, not suddenly, but with an irreversible clarity that demanded more than acknowledgement. He did not return immediately to his routines. Instead, he stood at the threshold of the estate for a long moment, the towering gates no longer symbols of control but reminders of all he had failed to see beyond them. The guard stepped aside as he entered, their movements precise and unquestioning, yet he noticed for the first time how their deference created distance rather than respect. It was a distance he had cultivated, one that now felt hollow. Inside, the familiar corridors greeted him with their usual stillness, but the silence carried a different weight. He moved through the halls without issuing commands, without summoning attendants, allowing the quiet to settle around him as he considered what must be done. Restitution, as he had offered it, had been rejected, and rightly so. What had lost could not be replaced with comfort or status. Yet in that refusal, she had given him something far more difficult, a responsibility that extended beyond obligation. By the following morning, the estate stirred with an unusual sense of anticipation. Word had spread that the Duke had called for an assembly, not limited to his advisors but open to those within his domain who wished to attend. Such gatherings were rare, and rarer still was the absence of clear purpose behind them. When entered the great hall, the murmurs quieted, replaced by a tense expectation. He stood before them without the rigid detachment that had long defined him. His posture remained composed, but there was a visible shift in his bearing, as though he no longer relied on authority alone to hold the room. "There is a matter that has remained unspoken for too long," he began, his voice steady but unembellished. "It concerns not only my past but the foundation upon which my present stands." The audience listened, their attention sharpened by the unfamiliar tone he carried, did not rush his words, nor did he soften them. "Years ago, during an event recorded only in fragments, my life was preserved under circumstances I neither questioned nor fully understood. I accepted the account given to me and continued without seeking what had been omitted." His gaze shifted briefly, as though acknowledging the weight of that omission. "That was a failure on my part." A quiet stir moved through the hall, subtle but undeniable. "The truth is this," he continued. "A man unknown to this estate and unrecognized in its records ensured my survival at the cost of his own. His actions were neither documented nor honored, and his sacrifice was allowed to fade into silence." The words settled heavily, their clarity leaving no room for misinterpretation. Allowed the silence to follow before speaking again. "That silence ends now." There was no grandeur in the declaration, no attempt to elevate it beyond its meaning. It was simple, direct, and absolute. The man's name will be recorded, his actions acknowledged, and his family restored to the dignity that was them, not as an act of generosity, but as a correction of what should never have been overlooked. Among those present stood near the back of the hall, her presence unnoticed by most but not by him. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment there was no distance of rank, only the shared understanding of what had led them there. Descended from his place, crossing the space between them with deliberate steps. The movement alone drew attention, yet he did not pause or alter his course. When he reached her, he did not speak immediately. Instead, in a gesture that stilled the entire room, he lowered himself, not in ceremony but in acknowledgement. "I cannot return what was lost," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less steady. "But I will not allow it to remain unrecognized. For that, and for my failure to hear you when you came before me, I ask your forgiveness." The simplicity of the words carried more weight than any declaration of power. Regarded him for a moment, her expression unchanged yet thoughtful. The room remained silent, every gaze fixed upon the exchange. "Forgiveness is not given for words alone," she said at last. "I know," he replied. There was no defense in his tone, no attempt to lessen the truth of her response. He remained where he was, not out of obligation, but because he understood that this moment required patience rather than resolution. After a pause, inclined her head slightly. "Then let your actions speak," she said. Rose, not with relief but with acceptance. The path ahead would not be defined by a single act, no matter how visible. It would require consistency, change that extended beyond himself into the structure he governed. In the days that followed, those changes began to take form. Records were amended, not quietly but with clear intent. The story of that night was written in full, no longer reduced to fragments. Policies that had once favored distance over understanding were reconsidered, not hastily but with deliberate care. Remain within the duchy not as a recipient of favor, but as a presence that continued to challenge the assumptions the estate had long held. She did not seek proximity to power, yet she did not avoid it either. When their paths crossed, the conversations between her and were measured, shaped not by obligation, but by a gradual recognition of mutual respect. He listened more than he spoke, not out of uncertainty, but because he had learned the cost of failing to do so. She observed more than she judged, allowing his actions to define him rather than his words. Over time, the distance between them shifted, no longer marked by misunderstanding, but by a careful trust that neither rushed nor faltered. It was not immediate, nor was it simple, but it was real in a way that neither of them had expected. One evening, as the light softened across the estate, they stood within the courtyard where the walls no longer felt as imposing as they once had. The air was still, carrying none of the tension that had marked their first meeting. "You have changed," said her voice, quiet but certain. "I have begun to," replied. She considered this before speaking again. "That is enough for now." He met her gaze, understanding the weight of those words. Change was not a moment, but a process, one that required more than intention to sustain. Will you remain? He asked, not as a command, but as a question. His expression softened slightly, though her composure remained. For now, she said,